So good evening, everyone. On behalf of TaskNet, I would like to welcome you all to Medcast Insights into Healthcare, a learning initiative by TaskNet. Today, it's a great pleasure to have with us Dr. Shastri SM, who is an Associate Professor, Department of Hepatology, Institute of Liver and Biliary Sciences, New Delhi. We welcome you, sir. Sir, we look forward to hear from you on today's topic of discussion, evaluating the clinical effects of midodrine in hepatorenal syndrome. Over to you, Dr. Shastri.
Yeah, basically we'll be learning about hepatorenal syndrome, and I hope everyone can hear me. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. The basic purpose of this talk will be centered around learning what is hepatorenal syndrome, and once we understand the diagnosis and the management steps, we'll be able to understand fit in the midodrine or whatever vasoactive agents in between. So it will be very basic lecture, and I'll try to simplify my presentation to the maximum. Yeah, I'll share my slide. Are the slides visible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this will be our outline. How do we measure renal dysfunction in cirrhotics? How do we evaluate the patients with hepatorenal syndrome? And how do we treat? So measurement of renal dysfunction. I'll just full screen it. Yeah, as we know, serum creatinine is the most widely available and the most commonly used test for assessing the renal dysfunction. It has so many flaws with it, and it is not accurate, especially in patients with cirrhosis. The production of creatine, which is the precursor of the serum creatinine, is decreased in hepatic dysfunction, and the patients with decompensated liver cirrhosis have very reduced muscle mass, sarcopenia. There is increased tubular secretion of creatinine. So they'll have a lower production of creatine, conversion of creatine to creatinine. And jaundice and hemolysis in cirrhosis will also lead to spuriously low levels of serum creatinine. So serum creatinine is an inaccurate marker of renal function or renal reserve in patients with liver cirrhosis. This is very widely known. And so the renal function is assessed by glomerular filtration rate estimating equations. As creatinine itself is fallacious, the GFR measured by using the creatinine values is further fallacious. And additionally, the GFR measuring formulae were initially evaluated. Most of them were for the CKD patients. Very few studies are available. Very few formulae are available, particularly for assessing the renal dysfunction in cirrhotic patients. And all the formulae which are most commonly used, the Cockcroft-Gault equation, MDRD equation, CKD equation, they are basically meant for CKD patients to evaluate GRF. There is one less evaluated, although accepted, Royal Free Hospital cirrhosis GFR score, which is available, and which includes the ascites, serum sodium levels, urea, and INR levels. And this has been validated recently, but not in routine use. So we still depend on serum creatinine despite its severe limitations. Additional markers like cystatin C. Cystatin C is a byproduct of cellular metabolism produced by all the cells in the human body, and it is eliminated through the kidney, and the values are serum cystatin C levels are also shown to correlate very well with GFR, glomerular filtration rate. And some formulae have come up which have used combined the serum creatinine and cystatin C levels, and these formulae are shown to be better models of estimating the glomerular filtration rate or kidney function in patients with cirrhosis. And these are the formulae. I'll not go into details, combining both serum creatinine and cystatin C. And so creatinine cystatin C equation, this is for understanding that these are the things which may become a routine or regular practice in future. These are the available and established tests which are available and which we routinely do at ILBS as well. So When creatinine itself is a fallacious marker and it is very difficult to assess the kidney functions in a cirrhotic patient, and just imagine how difficult it is to diagnose hepatorenal syndrome, which is it will be because the treatment and the outcomes and management depends on diagnosing the HRS. So the most of the talk of my portion of my lecture will be focused on how do we diagnose HRS. So initially in the older days, the rifle definition was used. Now it is obsolete, although the skeleton remains the same. There's risk, injury, failure, loss of function, and end-stage renal disease. Risk when creatinine is more than a particular level, 1.5. More than 2 times the upper limit is injury. More than 3 times is failure. Along with that, urine output quantification was also used. These were the older days for staging, defining acute kidney injury. Not very old, 10 years, still 10 years prior, we were using REFAL criteria. Then came the KDIGO criteria, which divides the acute kidney injury into stage 1, 2, and 3 based on the increase of serum creatinine from the baseline of more than 0.3 milligrams or raising 1.5 to 1.9 times from the baseline compared to the baseline is within 48 hours prior to. So the important fallacy of this KDIGO, this thing is we should have a baseline creatinine to tell the patient if he is having AKI or CKD. If we do not know the baseline creatinine, it will be difficult to say whether the patient has AKI or CKD. So further evolution, and additionally the anuria or CKD will be in stage 3. RRT, renal replacement therapy, those who go into dialysis will be stage 3 of acute kidney injury. So recently the most accepted one or the commonly used one is the AKIN criteria, acute kidney injury network diagnostic criteria for AKI. This again the stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 around the more than 0.3 milligram creatinine raised from the baseline. If the patient has creatinine of 0.6 at the baseline, if it develops a 0.9 creatinine, then also it will come under stage 1 AKI or a raise of 1.5 to 2-fold. If the patient had a creatinine of 0.4, if we get 0.6 or 0.8, that is also a stage 1 AKI. And additionally, the urine output criteria is also important. Stage 2 is 2 to 3-fold the baseline of creatinine or 0.6 from the baseline. If the patient had creatinine of 0.5 to 1 is the stage 2, and urine output less than 0.5 ml per kg per hour. If a 70 kg man producing less than 35 ml urine per hour for consecutive 12 hours will be stage 2, 6 hours will be stage 1, and less than 0.3 ml on over 24 hours or anuria for 12 hours will be stage 3, or creatinine level raised of more than 3-fold from the baseline or more than 4 milligram in absolute numbers will be stage 3. And the consistent, it eliminated the use of an estimated GFR. We just need to know the baseline levels. If we do not know the baseline creatinine, we can just monitor over 4 to 2 days and measure the creatinine again and then decide. And 2 readings of serum creatinine would be required. And within the 24 hours, you can use the urine output criteria to stage them into stage 1, 2, 3 of acute kidney injury. Yeah, currently used terminologies in AKI in cirrhotic patients is AKI HRS, AKI non-HRS. Non-HRS includes if the patient has active sediments in the urine or like RBCs, or if he has proteinuria, then it would be non-HRS AKI. Like AT and acute tubular necrosis. After ruling out other nephrotoxic agents or insults, then it is called acute kidney injury HRS, AKI HRS, then stage 1, 2, 3, whatever. And if the patient had a persistent raised creatinine for more than 3 months, then it is called CKD, HRS CKD, or it is no more called a AKI. So AKI HRS, AKI non-HRS, CKD, and acute on chronic kidney disease. If the patient has persistent high creatinine due to whatever cause, be it type HRS or CKD, on the top there is an acute incident, then that will be acute on chronic CKD. So now the terms which we are clear so far is AKI, how do we define what is Akin criteria? Akin stage 1, 2, 3, and Akin 1, 2, 3 can be Akin acute kidney injury HRS, acute kidney injury non-HRS, and chronic kidney disease. So we now, once we understand this, then we can move forward. We should also rule out other diseases like particularly cirrhosis related, some patients with before that, the baseline creatinine concentration is very important. This is the baseline standard stabilized creatinine over the last 3 months. What was the least creatinine available report if we have? And I think I told about the definition of AKI and the staging 1, 2, 3. We have covered this. And further, we should also note down, document the progression, regression to a lower stage, progression to the next stage, stage 1 to 2, 2 to 3 is a progression. Regression is the other way. And the response to treatment is a complete response if the serum creatinine concentration comes back to less than 0.3 milligrams from the baseline. Like if baseline was 0.6, even if it reaches 0.9, it is a complete response. And no regression, no reduction in creatinine with treatment on AKI is no improvement, no response. In between is partial response. So this is also important. And next, we should also I think I covered this. This has been, we should rule out other causes of AKI in liver patients, like some hepatitis B or C will have a membranous glomerulonephropathy, or patients with alcoholic liver cirrhosis may have IgA-related nephropathy, which will have active sediments in the urine and proteinuria. And there should also be additionally a lack of recent nephrotoxic drug intake like painkillers, beta blockers, or any recent complementary alternative medication intake, which can potentially cause liver kidney injury. So the new diagnostic type criteria for the type 1 HRS, this is HRS AKI, is AKI according to the, I told the AKI criteria. And additionally, for 2 days, we should try with volume replacement and no improvement of serum creatinine concentration to less than 1.5 milligrams after at least 2 days of nephrotoxic drug withdrawal and albumin or volume replacement to a maximum dose of 100 gram per day over 2 days. Then the absence of shock and in the absence of recent nephrotoxic drugs and in the absence of parenchymal kidney disease or proteinuria or hematuria or active sediments in the urine, on urine routine exam or ultrasound, there is no stone or stuck or something like that. So ruling out other causes, this is very important to diagnose or label a patient as HRS. And almost 50% of the cirrhotic patients with ascites will develop acute kidney injury at some point of their illness. And it has been shown that acute kidney injury itself is very common, but HRS is the prevalence is very low. As you can see, only 8% of the patients of this decompensated liver cirrhotic develop HRS, and 17% of 19%, very small quantity of those with AKI actually have HRS. So it becomes very important to diagnose HRS amongst the AKI in patients with cirrhosis. Again, the similar in patients with liver cirrhosis with AKI, many studies have shown that acute tubular necrosis is a more commoner cause of acute kidney injury. And next is the pre-renal AKI, then followed by HRS type 1 and type 2. Remember, HRS is also a pre-renal AKI in which there is excessive renal vasoconstriction in the presence of splanchnic and systemic vasodilatation. There is relative hypovolemia, underfilled arterial system. So the kidneys think there is a low volume system in the body. So the renal arteries constrict, which lead to conserve the fluid in the system. And that's how the HRS develops. There can be other reasons of other causes of pre-renal AKI like absolute shock, septic shock, or other things. So they are more common than the. So volume replacement to rule out other causes of pre-renal AKI is important before labeling a patient as type 1 or type 2 HRS. Type 1 is of a shorter duration and type 2 is a longer duration with a lower level of creatinine. So coming to the treatment of HRS, first is the general measures. How can we prevent it? Next is pharmacological, like volume expansion and vasoconstrictors. Then non-pharmacological, like transjugular intrahepatic portosystemic stent placement or liver transplant or combined liver kidney transplant. These are the non-pharmacological or surgical options we have. And what is the step one in diagnosis of AK? Patient with cirrhosis with ascites presents with a creatinine of above the normal thing. What is the step one? So first we should see how much the creatinine has risen from the baseline. If there is more than 50% raise from the baseline or serum creatinine by more than 0.3 milligrams, I'm repeating this so that these things are registered. If this much of raise is not there, or we do not have a no baseline creatinine to begin with, then we should repeat the serum creatinine at 48 hours. If there is like meeting of criteria, one of the two, then it is AKI. And once we have the diagnosis of AKI, then we proceed to the step two. If we do not have the baseline, repeating creatinine, on repeat, if there is decrease in serum creatinine, then it is resolving AKI and just a follow-up. If the like maybe diuretic related AKI, that is resolving and we are following it up. Or a stable patient, we should evaluate stable patient means creatinine remains high, but that neither improves nor worsens. Then evaluate for CKD or any other causes of deranged kidney functions. And on repeating, there is still an increase in further progression of serum creatinine. Then during this 48 hours, we also refill the system like shock related or other hypovolemia causes are excluded by giving them the albumin and other antibiotics. And if the creatinine further worsens, then it is AKI. Then we will proceed to the next step. So we should rule out the shock and other causes of AKI. Coming to step two, in step two, we stage the patients of AKI HRS into stage 1 to 3, as I told earlier. I'll not repeat it. And stage 3 is the need for renal replacement therapy or creatinine more than 3 or 4 milligrams, or further increase in creatinine to more than 3 times from the baseline. So just a simple, why staging is important? Because most of the cases of HRS, they come in stage 2 or 3. Most of the stage 1 with just 0.3 milligram increase or less than 1.5 to 2 times the baseline, they are usually due to hypovolemia or due to you can say diuretic related or drug related acute kidney injury, which usually resolve within 48 hours with general simple general preventive measures or treatment measures. So what are the general measures? Discontinue the diuretics, beta blockers, or potential nephrotoxic drugs. Reduce the dose of lactulose, or in case you are suspecting diarrhea as the reason for hypovolemia. Patients who have actually lost blood like hematemesis or something, they should receive blood products. Sepsis with septic shock should be managed, and every patient with acute kidney injury in a patient with in the background of cirrhosis should be worked up for infections, because SBPs or any infections are the most common precipitant event for the development of HRS or even any kidney injury for that matter. And so every patient who presents with acute kidney injury in a cirrhosis should be given antibiotics, preferably IV, prophylactically, because even if you don't find any obvious source of infection. I told this, we should rule out other causes particular to liver disease, which can also cause acute kidney injury or maybe CKD, and it can be treatment related or it can be disease related. And this is very important slide. These are the usual tests what we order in a patient who has AK in cirrhosis: urine osmolarity, urine sodium, fractional excretion of sodium percentage, and urine sediments. In patients with ATN, as I told, this is the more commoner cause of AK in cirrhosis, may have muddy brown granular grass, or sometimes you can also see RBCs, or it can see neutrophils, active sediments you can see. Urinary osmolarity in both renal and HRS, osmolarity will go high because there is water retention by the kidneys, considering that renal vasoconstriction and like physiological underfilled system. In ATN, there is the urinary osmolarity will be low. Urine sodium will be high, which will be less than 20 millimoles per day in HRS or prerenal. Fractional excretion of sodium would be more than 2 in ATN or less than 1 in the other two. Okay, so this is very important. Urinary osmolarity, urinary sodium, fractional excretion, and urinary routine for sediment. These are the simple tests, easily available tests, which can be done at every place to rule out ATN from HRS. And additionally, you can also do urinary NGAL. Urinary NGAL is urinary neutrophil gelatinase associated lipocalin, which is increased more in patients who have ATN, and in the prerenal and the HRS, there is a little lesser levels of maybe the cutoff that is told for NGAL is maybe around 194 microgram per gram of creatinine would differentiate between HRS and the ATN. More than this would be ATN, and less than 194 would be HRS. So other biomarkers like many others have been tested, but I'm not going to details. NGAL is again easily available in many laboratories, and we do it here in regularly, mainly to differentiate from HRS from the ATN. So after ruling out the other causes, after ruling out proteinuria, microhematuria, abnormal renal findings on ultrasound, and we start the patient on albumin 1 gram per kg. It is very difficult to give so high volume of albumin. Like if a patient is 60 kg, you will have to give 60 gram per day for 2 days. That will be a little heavy. But the most what we use in ILBS is 40 gram per day for 2 days, along with plasmalite or isoosmolar IV fluids, because one is the cost and second is the volume overload risk and allergy risk in patients who receive very high volume of albumin. But usually we go up to 40 gram per day over 2 days. And if the AKI gets resolved, we closely monitor them. If it doesn't get resolved or if it worsens, then it meets the criteria for HRS. By book, the definition of HRS needs at least 48 hours to rule out other causes. So that is a little tricky thing. Sometimes we don't want to waste our time for 2 days, and we may think of adding a vasoconstrictor in the baseline if the clinical suspicion is very high for HRS. So how do we treat AKI-HRS after evaluating the response? It is always albumin along with vasoactive agents. Most useful one is the terlipressin, and noradrenaline in some studies have shown equal to terlipressin and more cost effective. And third group is octreotide, midodrine plus albumin. Albumin is common. I'll come to albumin in one slide in future, in further slides. And after this treatment, if there is complete response, that is creatinine within the 0.3 milligram of the baseline, then it is complete response. And if there is no response, then we call them no response. Partial responses between more than 0.3 but less than the value which the patient came with. So ideally, we may think if the vasoconstriction, renal vasoconstriction is the main reason for the development of HRS, then why not use a renal vasodilators like dopamine or something? Yeah, some message came. Yeah, hello, good evening. Okay. Renal vasodilators, somehow like dopamine or prostaglandins, theoretically they should be helpful, but somehow the isolated renal vasodilators are of no use, because the basic pathogenesis in the development of HRS is splanchnic vasodilatation of increased portal circulation. So what we need is a vasoconstrictor which will constrict the renal, the splanchnic vessels and as well as the systemic vessels. That will increase the effective circulatory volume in the system and increase the blood supply to the kidney, and that's how the creatinine gets better. So it is systemic vasoconstrictors. They are useful, not the renal vasodilators. It could be the vasoactive agents or midodrine or norepinephrine. Yeah. As I said, albumin is must for the use in any acute kidney injury, because in addition to the volume expansion, it has many other properties like it is a scavenger of many cytokines. It is antioxidants. It is anti-inflammatory, and additionally, it also improves the renal functions by itself, and it also refills the system. So the quality and quantity of albumin in a patient with cirrhotic petechiae is very poor. Oxidized albumin is circulated, so we should give the extra albumin from outside so that it has so many other functions other than expanding, volume expanding property. So use of albumin is a mandate in every patient with who presents with AKI in patients with cirrhosis. So coming to vasoconstrictors, terlipressin is we are lucky we have this available in India. Somehow in US still it is not available. It is not at FDA approved, but still it is a wonder drug. It binds to the V1 receptors, vasopressin receptors of the vascular smooth muscle cells and causes vasoconstriction. It also additionally by causing the constriction of the systemic and as well as the splanchnic circulation, it also decreases the intrahepatic resistance by dilating the intrahepatic vessels. This is of particular use in reducing the portal hypertension in multiple ways, and which has direct benefit effect of affecting the renal function in cirrhosis, because the portal pressure is the basic center of the pathogenesis of development of acute kidney injury in cirrhosis, which leads to further splanchnic dilatation and other things. So, but not every patient will respond to terlipressin. There is also confusion whether we should give by bolus or infusion. That's a second issue. We can use either way. Infusions are better tolerated than the bolus doses. Overall, terlipressin is considered to be effective in around half of the patients who have HRS. And in the meta-analysis, the overall reduction in the mortality by giving the vasoconstrictor terlipressin is by 30%. So terlipressin can decrease the mortality or improve the survival in patients who have HRS in cirrhosis. So how do we assess the patient if he is responding to terlipressin or not? If the patient gets improvement in the mean arterial pressure by more than 5 mmHg on day 3, I hope everyone understands mean arterial pressure, and the baseline creatinine, if it is less than 5 milligrams, preferably less than 3.5 milligrams at baseline, if the patient is not very advanced liver failure like Child-Pugh C, CTP more than 13 or bilirubin more than 10, they do not respond. But the more advanced liver disease do not respond. Lower CTP, lower bilirubin, less than 3 or 4 of creatinine, they do respond better. And urinary NGAL should be lesser. That is when we call the HRS, and those are the ones who are likely to respond. Usually they respond within a median period of 7 days to the vasoactive agents, and faster recovery in patients with a lower creatinine and less advanced liver failure, and that too only in 50% of the HRS. Noradrenaline in multiple 3 or 4 small studies, even one from the Art Center, has shown to be equally effective as terlipressin in the management of type 1 HRS, and 30-day mortality was also similar between the two, and reversal of HRS were also similar between the two groups. Although numbers are very small, the 83% looks big, but numbers are very small. Now only 12 patients were studied. So, but we can say it can also be used where there are cost constraints, or wherever terlipressin is contraindicated, maybe because of severe hyponatremia or maybe because of additional cardiac ailment in the patient. So next comes the midodrine. This has been available in India for last 3 years or so, 2-3 years, and basically it is again an alpha-1 agonist acting on this vascular smooth muscles, constricting both the arterioles and the veins, constricting the splanchnic and as well as the systemic vessels. The main advantage of this is it is available in the oral form, in the borderline cases, or the patients who respond to the injectable vasoactives. We can continue this one on the oral doses in the OPD basis, but ideally it should be combined with additional albumin and the octreotide injection subcutaneous twice a day. That is when it works much better, and it is the prodrug converted to active drug by the liver, and peak effect in 1 hour. Main side effects are supine hypertension, compensatory bradycardia, and the urinary retention can happen. Ideally, the evening dose should be given 4 hours prior to sleeping, because supine hypertension can happen. Midodrine is also FDA approved for postural hypotension or autonomic dysfunction in elderly patients. So the dosing should be spaced accordingly, that patient will not recline or sleep for 3 to 4 hours, ideally. Otherwise, it's very safe drug. The doses are up to, maybe we should start with 5 to 7.5 mg thrice a day, and then escalate it according to the blood pressure response and and the creatinine response. And the maximum dose can be 12.5 milligram 3 times a day. Although terlipressin plus albumin is superior to midodrine, octreotide, and albumin, but octreotide, midodrine, and albumin is superior to placebo or giving no treatment in patients with AKI. I would say in those who do not tolerate terlipressin because of peripheral cyanosis, hyponatremia, or cardiac ailments, the second line for the urgent inpatient management would be octreotide, midodrine, and albumin. And follow-up to patient who have refractory ascites or repeated HRS or maybe type 2 HRS, the midodrine can be continued on oral form in the long term and follow-up. These are the doses recommended. I think we can skip this slide. We know terlipressin we can use either in the continuous infusion form or the bolus form. Maximum dose is 12 mg per day. 2 mg fourth hourly can be used. And usually what we use is 1 mg or 2 mg 24-hour continuous infusion bolus. Somehow we feel safe with using 2 milligram over 24 hours, but we can go up much higher. And NORAD infusions up to usually around 1 to 2 milligram per hour. Monitoring the mean arterial pressure, the targeting more than 10 mmHg elevation with the noradrenaline. In combination, both midodrine and octreotide need to be continued to be administered until serum creatinine is less than 1.5. Maybe after once this is achieved, then we can continue with simple oral midodrine on the OPD basis. Till then, we should combine midodrine, octreotide, and of course the albumin. See, albumin has to be given in concomitantly in all the vasoactive agents, maybe around 40 gram a day. That should be more feasible. So coming to the non-pharmacological treatments, we have MARS, molecular adsorbent and recirculating system. There is also one more thing called Prometheus. These two are the liver dialysis methods. Some of them, a couple of studies, company-sponsored studies, had a negative results or negative effect on survival in patients with cirrhosis, but only one subgroup of patients who had survival benefit was decompensated cirrhotic with AKI. So MARS is a decent option in which fresh albumin is circulated outside, and it's like a dialysis with an external circulating membrane and a fluid. By diffusion the creatinine and other things are exchanged, bilirubin and everything is exchanged into the membrane to the albumin circulating outside the body in the dialysis kind of system. But it is very expensive, limited benefit, many negative trials, only useful in patients with liver decompensated cirrhosis with HRS. So in HRS patients particularly, the liver dialysis can be attempted, and that too it is used as a bridge to the transplant. Those who respond, they should be advised to go for the transplant at the earliest, because otherwise the recurrence and there is no long-term benefit with this. And the second one is TIPS, transjugular intrahepatic portosystemic stent. I'll discuss in a few slides. That is very interesting and very important measure in management of both refractory ascites and as well as HRS. And renal replacement therapy, although it might be required in a few patients. I'll discuss in a couple of slides in further. So coming to TIPS. TIPS is like, if you can see here, I hope I'm, yeah. Placing a stent from the IVC to the right portal vein branch. This is a stent placed through the liver. It decreases the portal pressure. So the root cause of the refractory ascites or the HRS, the splanchnic vasodilatation and portal hypertension, is taken care of by the stent. That will also increase the change the hemodynamics, improve the volume in the systemic circulation to be delivered to the kidneys. More volume delivered to the kidneys, vasoconstriction resolves, renal vasoconstriction resolves, and HRS and everything is recovered. It has been in use for HRS since last maybe 10 to 15 years or so, and TIPS consistently improves urinary sodium excretion and renal dysfunction in patients with cirrhosis and refractory ascites, and it is very well documented. But it takes some time, maybe a month or two, and for creatinine and ascites to resolve, and 70 to 80% of the patients do respond. But of course, we should rule out CKD or other causes of kidney injury before the patient undergoes TIPS. TIPS increases the blood flow to the heart. Direct pressure is transmitted to the heart. So the cardiac workup, renal clearance are important prior to subjecting the patient for TIPS. But otherwise, it is very useful in some patients in whom it works magically. Some patients do have a very good long-term survival. We have many patients who are in follow for more than a couple of years or 3 years. But still, TIPS is not a definitive treatment. Patient may still require transplant after TIPS. Okay. There are many studies. TIPS to be useful, more useful in HRS. HRS is less frequent in patients who undergo TIPS, but there is higher risk of hepatic encephalopathy. The cost is high, and the survival is there is conflicting data. There is no difference or better with TIPS. At least it is. It's very conflicting data, but it should be a very well selected set of patients who should be offered TIPS. So TIPS reversal of HRS occurs in nearly 50% within 3 months, and at least the rapidity of refilling of ascites or worsening of AK or readmissions because of ascites and AK will be decreased. And sometimes patients can have delayed recovery. Of course, HE is a complication. It's a very good alternative, and it should be definitely thought of in every patient who has difficult to treat HRS or who has refilling ascites. And there is also some data on initial treatment of AK with vasoconstrictors. Once the creatinine gets better, it's a downstaging of AK HRS from stage 3 to stage 2 to stage 1, and then go for TIPS. That is a better way to go for TIPS rather than directly going for the TIPS. And such patients do have a better recovery from HRS than those who straight away go for only vasoactive agents or only TIPS. Okay, so you can see vasoconstrictor plus TIPS has a very wonderful, like although numbers of patients were very less, the very good response to recovery of HR survival compared to only vasoactive agents with such a low survival. With only TIPS as well, the only 30-day survival is 70%, 90-day survival is 42%. But when we combine both, maybe initially recover the HRS with terlipressin, albumin, and go for TIPS, and then continue with midodrine or maybe some diuretics, and post midodrine the diuretic tolerance also gets better. So we should be very calculatively combining and permutation combination for every patient, and many do respond with combination therapies. Renal replacement therapies, sometimes with patients who end up developing anuria, oliguria, acidosis, high creatinine more than 4 or 5 milligrams, they require renal replacement therapy. And but at the end, those who end up requiring renal replacement, they have a longer hospital stay, more morbidities, lesser short-term survival. But at the end, most patients will have to initiate RRT as a lifesaver. And if the patient continues to receive RRT, renal replacement therapy, beyond 6 weeks, then the chances of coming out of the RRT would be difficult, and isolated liver transplant would be difficult if the patient goes on continuation of renal replacement more than 6 weeks. I discussed about the mass. I'll not repeat. Coming to liver transplant, the root cause of the complications like refractory ascites, HRS, everything is centered around liver. So replacing a liver with a new liver is of course the best treatment you can think of in managing complications related to liver cirrhosis. So, but the recovery takes several weeks after liver transplantation alone as well, with renal sodium restriction and serum creatinine normalization taking around a month of time after LT in majority patients. Usually 2/3 of patients to get a recovery of the AKI, and importantly, kidney functions never recover in around a quarter of patients. They are the difficult to treat patients. In those patients, even post liver transplant, they may end up requiring renal replacement. So, what the ideal way to go around is rather than going for a simultaneous liver kidney transplant, if we can rule out the organic CKDs and if it is only HRS, liver transplantation followed by, in those who do not recover, advising them a renal transplant would be the best way forward. Kidney after liver, depending on how they respond. That is how it is the best way to move forward. Usually patients who have a shorter duration of HRS or younger patient recipient age or immediate liver allograft function, as evidenced by the post-LT day 7 bilirubin levels coming down rapidly, they have a better recovery of renal recovery within 1 month. So those who do not remain recover, their prognosis is very dismal even after transplant, with around less than 30% surviving up to 1 year. So kidney after liver transplant should be considered in a hastened way in such patients. So the patient, this is the policy allocation eligibility for a simultaneous liver kidney, which includes patients with hepatic failure and with CKD, with sustained AKI, or with metabolic disease of kidney. They should go for simultaneous liver kidney transplant. If it is pure HRS, then we should go kidney after liver transplant only those who do not respond. Okay, as I said, if the patient requires hemodialysis or RRT or has a GFR of less than 25 for 6 consecutive weeks, then it is called sustained AKI, and this patient would require simultaneous. They're less likely to get their renal functions recovered after liver transplantation. As I said, post-transplant survival also depends on the pre-transplant creatinine levels. If they have a normal creatinine or a high creatinine, the survival is 5-year survival is lesser in those who have AKI pre, but that is the best option and we should go forward. And the same thing in a steady pace. And 2-week mortality rate is as high as 80% in patients who are not treated for a type 1 HRS. So type 1 HRS has a very dismal prognosis. Even otherwise, if we can improvise the survival by whatever the modality is possible, combining vasoactive agents, albumin, antibiotics, ruling out sepsis, treating infections, preventing infections, antibiotic prophylaxis, and TIPS or MARS or transplant, whatever, whichever the thing which improves the survival, because it has a very dismal prognosis of 80% mortality in 3 months once the patient develops type 1 HRS. So, but although this is an old study, the Perry-Jain study, recently we see little better survival than this with the advent of TIPS, midodrine, vasoactive agents, and other things. But still, it has a very dismal prognosis. 3-month survival in type 1, type 2 HRS in recent studies is 20% and 40%, not very good. It is what the many of the cancers. So this patient should be advised for early liver transplant so that the kidney functions might recover. And most of the cases of HRS are precipitated by infections, the most common being spontaneous bacterial peritonitis. Even a cellulitis or any minor infections in anywhere in the body can precipitate acute kidney injury or HRS in patients with advanced liver disease. The same thing in study wise, I will not go into the details of the study here. Of course, the antibiotic should be continued in a patient. It should be initiated on day 1, continued, and prophylaxis should be given in patients. Antibiotic prophylaxis in the long term with norfloxacin or rifaximin should be continued in every patient who develops HRS, especially those who have a very low serum acetic fluid albumin or high creatinine, lower sodium levels or higher CTP. They should be given with of course with one episode of any infection anywhere, be it pneumonia, UTI, or sepsis, or cellulitis, or SBP, they should be thought of continuing norfloxacin prophylaxis in the long term. Yeah, that's it. And prophylaxis in patients who undergo large volume paracentesis, more than 5 liters, they can develop like a post paracentesis circulatory dysfunction, paracentesis induced circulatory dysfunction. So they should be given a prophylaxis of albumin infusions and maybe vasopressors, in addition, one dose of terlipressin during LVP, or continuation of midodrine on oral for every patient who undergoes LVP, so that the development of PACD and AK or HRS after the tapping, after the paracentesis, would be reduced, and even the diuretic tolerance will be better. This could be one of the potential areas where vasoactive agents, especially the oral formulations, may be of benefit, may be of use. Yeah, of course, we should give albumin in every patient who undergoes paracentesis. So with this, I want to summarize, and this is the take-home messages. As I said, HRS renal functions are very difficult to assess. We should rule out every cause for renal dysfunction in patient with cirrhosis. Hepatorenal syndrome is diagnosed after excluding all other potential causes of acute kidney injury, be it infections or ATN or pre-renal volume hypovolemia or diuretic related. But HRS is a potentially reversible volume non-responsive functional renal impairment. That is to say, there is no intrinsic mechanical renal dysfunction. It is just the factory is good and the raw materials are not reaching the factory. That's why the kidney is unable to do the act. And with lower GFR and decreased renal blood flow, these patients have a very high mortality and poor quality of life because of associated refractory ascites and repeated admissions and infections. They need frequent monitoring of renal function, nutritional status, electrolytes, and other managements. Early tips or renal replacement therapy in suitable candidates, especially as a bridge to the transplant. And liver transplant should be considered before they end up developing permanent renal structural changes or CKD, and early liver transplant should be considered. Vasoactive agents are the core of the center, or in the center of the management of conservative management of HRS, so that the patient become fit for transplant, or they have a better quality of life, and of course some survival advantage with better quality of life. Some patients, some particular group of patients, they do good with vasoactive agents, regular albumins, and they tolerate diuretics better along with vasoactive agents. And maybe with or without tips, such patients can be postponed for liver transplant if their otherwise overall liver dysfunction or child status is very good. That can also be an option. We should have an open mind. So that's it for today. I think I could make some sense and give some message, and I'm open for questions. This will be my last slide.
Very well elaborated, sir. And same, I'll request the participants, if they're having any query, they can put in the Q&A box.
Either I was very clear or I was not at all clear.
No, it gives an impression that it was very clear.
It's okay. It's okay.
So I think we can conclude, sir.
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shastri, for joining with us today. It was really an insightful discussion for us as well as for our listeners. And I would also like to request and thank all the doctors for being with us and for their active participation during the session. Thank you and have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.